Right, everybody, welcome back. I'm Catherine Leonard, and I run the International National Trust Organisation. And of course, like many of us here in the room, our international organisations around the world are, children play a really important part in all of their work. And so I'm really looking forward to learning along with you today, this afternoon, about engaging children with heritage. And I have two lots of notes. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Alice Sage, who is currently property curator at Hilltop, Beatrix Potter's house in the Lake District, which is looked after by the National Trust. And Alice completed her PhD in 2021. Over to you, Alice.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's been a great day. I'm so full of ideas. So how do I...
Just go next. Right.
There we go. Right. So I'm going to talk about a project that I did following the theme of the day in lockdown in 2020, photographing fairies. This was a project that I did with Edinburgh Young Carers and Multicultural Family Base in Edinburgh. Combined historical photography with contemporary art by young people and some significant Scottish artists. It was originally intended as a physical exhibition, but for obvious reasons moved online. And the exhibition is still online, and I invite you to go and look at it. All I can give today is a brief introduction, so please, stills.org/fairies. And I also have the little publication that I made as part of this exhibition, and I've got 6 left, so I've brought them for first come, first served, if you want to know more and see the work that was produced. So the inspiration for this project was the 100th anniversary of the publication of the Cottingley Fairy photographs in December 1920, in the aftermath of the worst war the world had ever seen. Some pictures appeared in the Strand magazine here, which claimed to prove the existence of fairies. They were presented by Arthur Conan Doyle, but had been taken by 18-year-old Elsie Wright and 12-year-old Frances Griffiths, 2 cousins who lived in Yorkshire. And I described these as the original viral selfies. These pictures had been taken a few years earlier during the First World War, but it was only in the aftermath that they reached a traumatised population in suspended mourning. The fairies, and you're probably really familiar with these photographs, the fairies responded to a deep desire to believe in a life beyond and outside human experience and beyond mortality and suffering. Many people were convinced by them, but they also sparked fierce debate about girls' agency and abilities. Oh, there's a quote missing here from Arthur Conan Doyle that says, if I can remember something like, "We have traced these photographs to 2 children of the artisan class. It's quite clear that that they couldn't have faked them," words to that effect. For some, it was easier to believe in fairies than to accept that 2 apparently ordinary girls could have pulled off the hoax. There is so much more to say about the Cottingley fairies. Again, I invite you to look at the exhibition. So the photography project that I did in 2020 set out to discover what 12-year-old girls, the same age as Frances Griffiths, thought about these photographs. Would the selfie generation be fooled by 100-year-old fakes? This was a creative project working with the photographer Morwenna Kearsley, and initially we hoped to use the dark rooms and digital studios at Stills Photography Centre in Edinburgh, but in March 2020 all that stopped, and long story short, we moved online. Very long story short. So we made up boxes of art materials and we drove them around to everybody's homes that was participating in the project. It was completely back to basics with paper and scissors and Pritt stick. We figured that Elsie and Frances had managed to make convincing fairies with just paper and scissors, so that's where we started. More cyanotypes. I think there was a lot of cyanotype paper in lockdown. We met once a week on Zoom to share the story of Elsie, Frances, and Conan Doyle and the fairies. We made collages, we captured the aura of objects in cyanotypes, and the group wrote comics about our supernatural experiences. Here's a story of how Charlie and her family saw a mermaid down at Portobello Beach in 2015. So the project developed in many different directions, from Cottingley outwards. We explored the techniques and the ideas, and mainly we kind of listened to the girls and were led by what they wanted to make and do. All of our plans had gone out the window, so we just kind of played it week to week and responded to what they thought about these pictures and figured out what we would do with them. I was very lucky to work with Morwenna, the artist, was incredibly flexible and creative. It's important to remember when we think about projects, I think, that we did in 2020, just what it was like, because all through the autumn of 2020, Scotland was having rolling, localised, full lockdowns. It was divided up into local councils, and you could only travel 5 miles from the border of your local authority, and you would suddenly hear that the shops were closed again. And for kids, they weren't able to go to school and they weren't able to meet in groups, and this kind of group activity was really the only chance they got to see their friends as well. At the outset of this project, the most relevant thing about the Cottingley fairy photographs was their fakeness. In 2019, the word fake was a common word of public discourse. We had Trump crying fake news about any criticism, and we had deep fakes online showing celebrities and politicians saying things they hadn't said. But throughout this project, I kind of realised that it wasn't about fakeness so much as fantasy, and the original Cottingley fairies were fantasies that responded to a time of crisis, both global and political and personal, as Frances and Elsie processed the impact of war upon their lives. They were playing with the idea of belief itself, and they were seized by people who wanted hope in any form. This is one of the images that the groups created. So to wrap it up, I will conclude with this, The Vampire's Cave, which was a self-portrait made by 12-year-old Jada. Jada was born in 2007, an exact century after Frances Griffiths. She's responded to the Cottingley photographs with a much darker vision of her own. Brown's fantasy replaces the sparkle of fairies with the gothic glamour of vampires. Instead of an idyllic woodland, we have a dark cave with fangs of rock. In the foreground, an unsmiling girl. In front of, it dawns on us, an empty mirror. The girl is the vampire. Jada has given herself the lead role in this supernatural encounter. So much of these girls' experience is mediated on screen and performed for the webcam, and never more so than in 2020. There is a reason that we call this generation the Zoomers. By the end of COVID, nearly 10% of Jada's life had been spent in some form of lockdown. No surprise then that Jada's fantasy included an empty mirror, a screen that refused to mediate her image. She's not duplicated or reflected, but stares at us directly. As someone who entered her home weekly on Zoom calls, I find this image wonderfully unsettling. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Alice. As a mother of a 13-year-old daughter, that really resonates with me. Thanks a lot. And we're moving, well done for keeping within time as well. Didn't have to wrestle you off the stage. We're moving swiftly on to our next speaker, who is Charlotte Slark, an AHRC Collaborative Doctoral Partnership student from Queen Mary University of London and the V&A Museum of Childhood. Her thesis, East is East, A Social and Cultural History of the V&A Museum of Childhood, 1970 to 2010, is due to be finished in the summer of 2022, and Charlotte's going to be talking about embracing interactivity at the Museum of Childhood. Over to you, Charlotte.
Let's move this along. Okay, that's me. Okay, so in January this year, satirical news site The Onion ran an article with the headline, "No Bullshit Children's Museum, just thousands of buttons that light up when pressed." The article states that the Boston Children's Museum had decided to lose the bullshit and just provide visitors with thousands of light-up buttons. In the article, the fictional museum head told reporters that, quote, "The nonsense-free displays would allow youngsters the chance to put their fingers on buttons of various sizes and shapes without the wasted space of demonstrations or informational plaques." While this article is clearly satirical, it does highlight a pervasive attitude towards interactivity and engagement within museums in general, and children's museums more specifically. But where has this disdain for interactive exhibits come from? Part of the issue is certainly the overuse of both interactivity as a catch-all term for a whole host of interventions with varying levels of actual interaction involved, and the seemingly gratuitous use of digital interactives in exhibitions and galleries in more recent years. There is actually a long history of his interactive displays being used to engage children in museums. For example, the Science Museum opened its children's gallery, which utilised buttons, pulleys and levers to teach children scientific principles away from the much more serious main galleries in 1931. However, even in the 1930s, curators were being called upon to defend the use of such interactives and were themselves keen to remind visitors that they should not think of the exhibits as things to play with, but to try to understand, to learn from them. And this really begs the question, why shouldn't children see these kind of exhibits as something to play with? Which leads me nicely to my main argument. Conflicting views of the role of interactivity in museums are often linked to anxieties about the role of museums in the 21st century, anxieties which ultimately boil down to the question of whether museums are for educating or for entertaining visitors, or, as is more often the case, children. So a really good case study for looking at both the links between children and interactivity and the tensions between museums as a site for education or entertainment is the Bethnal Green Museum of Childhood. For those of you who don't know it, the Museum of Childhood is a branch of Museum of the V&A situated in Bethnal Green in East London. It's currently going through a major redevelopment and has been recently renamed Young V&A. There are lots of really interesting things happening at Young V&A in terms of provision for children in museums, but it's important to understand how some of this thinking has developed. The way that the Museum of Childhood has perceived the value of its child visitors has fluctuated over time, and as such, so is the extent to which it embraced interactivity in its galleries. But in the closing decades of the 20th century, there was a change in how museums saw their audience and the importance of meeting their needs, and this had an impact on how museums value interactive displays. So this is the museum as it looked around the 1990s. So Julia Forbes and Mariana Adams have more recently argued that museum staff sometimes express discomfort at this idea of fun, worrying that it distracts from a more serious educational experience. But if fun is what a family values most highly, isn't that something we as practitioners should take to heart as we develop our interactive spaces? From the 1990s, visitor surveys at the Museum of Childhood were showing that what visitors increasingly wanted from the museum was fun, and I'm going to focus on a particular survey now to illustrate this. The 1995 Museum of Childhood survey really shows how visitors were starting to express a real interest in fun displays. The survey report states that, quote, "Nearly everyone expected there to be interactive exhibits, animated displays, and the encouragement of visitor participation." But what is really interesting is how much this appears to be due to the museum's links to children. Because the Museum of Childhood is often, correctly or not, seen as a museum for children rather than merely of childhood, it was not held to the same display conventions as, say, the main V&A. that this also seems to be due to the fact that the museum was seen to largely contain toys, even though it also displayed a whole host of other objects relating to children and childhood. Toys and interactive displays seem to have something vital in common. They are apparently something which adults should both grow out of, which is actually really sad when you start to think of it. The anxieties that can be tied to still appreciating both of these things as an adult can be summed up really nicely with this story from the visitor survey. Oh, sorry, I'm going to go around the other way. Okay, sorry. The 1995 visitor survey was split into two parts, a quantitative survey and a qualitative one. For the qualitative survey, feedback was gathered based on interviewing 6 mini-groups who were all visiting the museum on the 23rd of August 1995. This is the information we're given about the 6 groups. It is the couple with no children that I'll be talking about now, more specifically, couple, no children, man, or as I like to refer to him, Meccano Man. It becomes clear really early on in the survey report, that Meccano Man just really wants to see some Meccano. When asked the motivation behind his visit, he stated, quote, "I think what really influenced us to come was the fact that we had visited another toy museum and found it very entertaining, and I like Meccano and stuff, and I was interested to see what they had. All completely fair enough. He clearly knows what he likes." When asked about his expectations of what he would find at the Museum of Childhood, he bemoaned a lack of interactivity and again specifically mentions Meccano. Here, there is only one cabinet with Meccano in, just one set showing the parts, which is fair enough. In other places, you will find full working Meccano models where you can push a button and have a working display, which, to a child, is much more interesting. So what is really interesting here is that he's framed the disappointment and appeal of interactivity in terms of children finding it enjoyable. We have already been told that he has no children. He is visited as part of an all-adult couple and is obviously interested in Meccano in particular. He was clearly wanting to see more Meccano on his visit, set up in a case and working. It is something that he would find more interesting. Later on in the report, he is once again quoted framing the idea in terms of children's interest and enjoyment. But why does he feel like it has to be framed in the context of a child finding it more interesting? There seems to be this idea that interactivity is for children and that perhaps as an adult he should be seen to have graduated to more grown-up, static, or perhaps more traditionally didactic viewing. Perhaps the most important question is, what does this say about the value placed on children's interests? Interactive displays have a proven effectiveness as an accessible learning tool, but museums do not always utilise interactivity properly, overusing the term or unnecessarily implementing it to jazz up an otherwise static or seemingly dry subject or gallery, or simply in an attempt to make a gallery child-friendly. And while this is a completely valid and important critique, interactive interventions can also destabilise the serious didactic image of museums, which some individuals or institutions are still clinging to, which finally leads me to ask, does a museum have to be educational to be valid? So there you go. There's a select biography if you're interested.
Oh, thank you, Charlotte. I love the idea of Meccano Man. I'm going to be using that in the future. So we're moving on now to Joshua, and I'm sorry, Joshua, I'm going to gobble your surname. Sorry, Blamia, sorry. You can say it when you come online. Joshua is a research associate at the Institute for Community Research and Development at the University of Wolverhampton. The ICRD is a research institute committed to research drive policy development, driven, that must mean, promoting social mobility and delivering effective community-based transformational projects. And Joshua is going to talk to us today about young people's engagements with heritage, value and meaning. And here he is.
Hi there, yeah, thank you very much. I'm Joshua Blameyer, Research Fellow at the Institute for Community Research and Development, and we're working with colleagues at Arts Connect and Historic England to explore young people's engagements with heritage through a 2-part study. And so, PowerPoint please. So the project emerged from the view that from Historic England's perspective, and again, sorry, anecdotally, while there's lots of interesting work taking place across the country that attempts to engage young people with heritage matters, there's a real kind of lack of evidence as to the effectiveness of those programs and the different outcomes that they might produce. Sorry, again, PowerPoint. And in particular, there's a real gap in knowledge about engagements that sit outside of existing structures, be it kind of formal education, heritage venues, museums and such like. And so our focus is much more on activities which are local, place-based, extracurricular. So thinking particularly around some of the Heritage Lottery funds, Young Roots and later Kick the Dust programmes, for example. And obviously the wider context of this work is that heritage organisations are increasingly looking to engage a younger and wider audience, and also wish to make the case for the broader societal benefits that might arise from engagements with heritage. This is combined, I guess, with the need for a more holistic approach to thinking about education, as well as the fact that young people increasingly kind of embrace accruing the soft skills associated with some of these activities. And that was really highlighted in recent research by DCMS. Of course, there's also been an upswell in matters of interest, kind of in matters relating to heritage and questions around who gets to define heritage. And of course, that's really come out of things like the Black Lives Matter movement. And finally, these changes are set against obviously the long-standing kind of underrepresentation and exclusion of young people within heritage generally, particularly those from minority ethnic backgrounds. And so the wider purpose of this work is that Historic England essentially seek to reshape their approach to grant making to benefit young people. And therefore we hope that this research will kind of shape how Historic England use their resources, think about the practices that they might wish to support, and shape their future asks of government, as well as kind of informing the wider heritage, cultural and youth sectors as a whole. PowerPoint, please. And so essentially in the first piece of work, we published a call for research and reports. And during this work, we spoke to a number of stakeholders and practitioners within the field to really understand then what were some of the opportunities and challenges of doing this work. Again, sorry, PowerPoint. And so essentially what were the key findings? Well, we found that in contrast, there's a really well-established body of knowledge pertaining to the benefits of arts-related activities and outcomes such as personal development, skills, aspects around kind of identity, belonging and place, social inclusion, social cohesion, health and well-being as well. But in contrast, there's much less on the role of heritage and young people. So sorry, a couple of PowerPoints. And yeah, in contrast, then the evidence pertaining to heritage is much more confined to individual project evaluation reports, the effect of which is that they're neither kind of easily accessible nor actionable to the sector as a whole. What we did find, though, is that the projects that we looked at unanimously kind of reported lots of positive outcomes pertaining to enjoyment, skills development, and learning about heritage. And some projects went on to discuss the kind of the themes of sense of place, identity, belonging, social cohesion, and health and well-being. But one of the things we found is that this evidence isn't particularly, it's kind of not particularly robust and lacks depth. For example, determine precisely what does it mean to gain a better sense of place. There's also not necessarily much discussion around any potential negative outcomes that might arise out of young people's engagements in these activities. So there's a sense perhaps that this is kind of somewhat romanticized. So for example, do young people learn to disidentify with a place as a result of being involved in these activities? On the next PowerPoint, please. Yeah, there's a question around to what extent are these benefits kind of heritage specific? So to what extent are the outcomes that we see kind of arise specifically out of heritage, or could they be obtained through doing other activities such as kind of arts-based or sports-based activities? So essentially we want to ask, what is the role of heritage here? What work does heritage do in terms of some of the outcomes that we might see? And one of the other things that we really want to look at, and we've identified as a major gap, is the extent to which the outcomes that are discussed aren't really kind of scaled up and connected with these kind of key policy concerns around social cultural capital, social polarization, and this kind of language of left behind places in the context of levelling up. So again, as a key policy appeal with some of this stuff. Next slide, please. So really then, without going into all of this, is to really say that in the second stage of our project, we're moving into conducting some field work with young people, looking at established projects across the country and asking these kind of questions. So we're interested in looking at how do young people come to define heritage? What kind of positive or perhaps negative outcomes are associated with these activities? Focusing on the role of kind of a sense of place and place identity, health and well-being, and that's particularly pertinent, we think, given the context of the pandemic. And then how do some of these outcomes kind of connect with the wider agendas, as I said, around inequality, levelling up, and thinking about social inclusion. And so, final slide, please. Over the summer, we hope to be a bit further ahead than we perhaps are, but over the summer, we're moving to conduct some qualitative research with young people to explore these issues further. And we're going to be doing that through the lens of participatory, visual and creative kind of methodologies, looking to place young people's voices at the heart of our analysis. And that will involve co-creation of research activities with young people themselves. So practically that might involve kind of working with young people alongside kind of pre-existing activities that they might be being involved with in different projects, and have a list of some of the ones there that we're working with. Or it may be kind of doing some more bespoke stuff, even engaging young people as peer researchers as part of the process as well. So I'll kind of leave it there, but just to say these are the kind of the key things that have kind of emerged from our review. If you look on the next slide, there's a link to our review. Really eager to receive any feedback on that, and to hear what you think of the work we've been doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joshua. It's really interesting to hear that you've been exploring the idea of the sort of wider benefits to young people from heritage-based arts cultural programming, which leads very nicely on to our next session. This is actually pre-recorded. It's a discussion between me and Barbara Babwetiria of the Cross Cultural Foundation of Uganda. We recorded it because we were a bit worried about connectivity, but Barbara is going to join us hopefully for the Q&A after we show the video. And so the video we recorded as a bit of a rehearsal from our office in Swindon. So we sort of jumped straight into it because we weren't expecting it to be shown here. But here we are. We used the rehearsal, and the team at CCFU have edited it and added in some sort of extra visuals. And so I will roll the VT. I love saying that. And then Barbara will join us afterwards for the Q&A.
Tell me why CCFU got involved in heritage education 10 years ago, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Catherine. During our program implementation, we discovered that there is less involvement of young people in most of our heritage activities. More than 70% of our population are young people below the age of 32. Without engaging young people in heritage is oblivion in the future. So we assessed our programs and we went into involving young people, but especially we looked at engaging them within the formal learning institution, because we thought that would be much more sustainable as compared to out of school or informal education. There is a generally negative attitude and stereotype around Uganda's heritage, and this is influenced by a number of other factors. One is more about region that is non-African, that actually demonizes and takes our own heritage in Uganda to be satanic, archaic, and refers to it as witchcraft. So this has created a rift or a gap between the young people and their heritage. When you talk about heritage, what comes into a young person's mind is immediately witchcraft. So how do we then get to popularize our own culture, to create the love of our own heritage by our own young people?
What specific actions or initiatives did you take?
What we did was, first of all, to do a national level analysis of heritage education in the country. Who are the stakeholders providing this? What are the gaps? What could be much more beneficial if we are to engage young people? And what we actually came up with, one, was that we need to engage within the formal structures, engaging with the Ministry of Education to make sure that we influence the perception towards heritage from the learning institution. So we advocated with the National Curriculum Development Center for inclusion of heritage-focused studies so that young people can begin learning and appreciating their culture at a younger age. And we were very lucky that the curriculum in 2006 was focused, but to a small extent, only looking at incorporating indigenous languages within the school. So we built the capacity of the teachers. The Cultural Heritage Toolkit was developed and made much more simpler for students to understand while enjoying the different activities that this toolkit presents. We also looked at how then do we link these children from schools within the community. And that's the whole idea of community museums working as coordinating points came into play. In the long term, when children begin liking engaging with heritage, then a degree course could be put in place for them to actually pursue this as a professional course. And
I think that's really interesting that they're becoming children-led, the clubs. How has this engagement and this learning impacted young people?
Engaging young people in heritage education has made them much more ambitious and inquisitive, and they want to learn more and discovering who actually they are. Every year, CCFU sets up a national competition that engages young people. We set out a particular theme and we circulate it across the country. And young people are given time to actually research more about that theme, and they paint or draw and write about that particular theme in their community.
As an organisation, what have you learned? What are you still learning that might be useful for some of our other colleagues listening or here with us today?
Without the young people, the culture is dead. We are seeing young people coming up and taking more positions of responsibility. They are becoming cultural enthusiasts. Learning actually can be student-led. All you need to create an environment for them. Create the structures that will favor young people to explore and promote their own heritage. It's the role of technology and communication in heritage education. Young people are exposed to phones, television sets, and what they are learning sometimes is heritage from other places. Do not rise up and take advantage of these spaces that technology is providing with us. Then we are not also adapting to the pace that the world is moving. So what we've done also is to create a Facebook page for young people where they are sharing experiences. We have also created radio programs. Even, for example, during COVID, we said we shouldn't sit back, but rather can young people get to engage and speak to their young people using radio spaces. What is key is always linking these young people to their local communities. If you put it just at the formal spaces in schools, that alone is not enough because they tend to take it as part of the general subjects that they are learning. But the moment you anchor it back in the community, the learning becomes a reality for them and they live it as their own.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. But what I really like about it is you've got that local community and relevance piece, but it's also what you were saying about tech and about tech not being all bad for children, but being actually a really good way to connect with other, even with other countries. I know you had that project working with colleagues in Zimbabwe and Sierra Leone on the education and outreach stuff. And I just think the way that you're going from school all the way through to university and taking those young people with you and that their enthusiasm to set up their own clubs is really, really testament to how successful the program has been and that they're learning these incredibly transferable skills in the process. What you're doing with CCFU is really just a fantastic model for so many of our international partners into member organisations around the world. So thank you so much for sharing that experience with us today. Tell me